The series of events I'm about to recount happened over 30 years ago, during my early childhood. Forgive me if some details are shaky, but I'll try to remember as much as possible. I was around 10 years old. My extended family was massive. At that age, it was hard for me to remember the faces of all my relatives, let alone their names. At every family gathering, I was introduced to someone whose face I didn't recognize, even though they all seemed to recognize me. My dad was one of 9 children, so I had 8 sets of aunts and uncles on his side alone. My grandparents on my dad's side were extremely well off and had a massive beachfront property, which was communal along my dad and his siblings. I don't know its exact dimensions, but I'm pretty sure I could sleep over 30 people. Because of this, my family would often spend entire chunks of the summer down there. Both my parents had jobs that allowed them to either work remotely or spend a lot of time away from their offices. My dad's siblings and their kids would do the same. There was rarely a time when it was just our family at the beach house. I got along with all my cousins and preferred spending time at the beach house rather than at home, since I was closer with some of my cousins than any of my hometown friends. I liked a lot of my aunts and uncles too. My favorite by far was Uncle Joseph, who was the father of my cousin Brandon. Brandon was honestly kind of antisocial, and we didn't really play that much together. Uncle Joseph was awesome though, and he'd never fail to brighten my mood or make me laugh. In addition to being great with kids, he was a licensed therapist and psychiatrist, and was often who I'd turn to in times of need. There's a decent chance he knew more about me than my parents did. I confided in him regularly, and there was nothing I was uncomfortable divulging. Anyway, that summer, I began having tremendously graphic and disturbing nightmares. As far as I can recall, there weren't any common themes between them. They'd all just be about something psychologically taxing, like a family member dying or being alone forever, or something along those lines. I wish I could provide more details, but I've long since purged my mind of those horrors. I do remember one dream distinctly though. It was one of those false awakening dreams. I woke up and went downstairs to meet my parents for breakfast, like I do on a typical morning. When I got downstairs though, they weren't in the kitchen, and there was no food on the dining room table. I ran back upstairs and barged into my parents' and then siblings' rooms, but no one was there. The rest of the dream was basically me crying on my bedroom floor, wondering why everyone had abandoned me. After 3 or 4 of those nightmares in a row, I decided to tell my Uncle Joseph out of embarrassment of telling my parents. He listened with a concerned look on his face as I described the kinds of things I was experiencing, and he even started writing things down in his little notebook. He instructed me to do some meaningful internal self-reflection, as something was clawing at my subconscious. What kind of self-reflection was I supposed to do though? I was 10 years old. He told me he'd mull things over, and that I should come back to him if the problem persisted. Of course, it did. A few days and nightmares later, I gave Uncle Joseph an update. He told me he'd been thinking about the situation, and that he had figured out what was going on in my brain. He said that even though I didn't think it, I was deeply frustrated with my parents and was harboring some unresolved resentment towards them. I was more confused than I've ever been. I was nothing if not a well-behaved, polite, grateful kid. I had always listened to my parents and loved them more than anything. Uncle Joseph knew what he was talking about though. He was a therapist after all. I assumed he had dealt with similar situations in the past and considered myself lucky that he was helping me. I asked him how I should proceed with everything, and told him this newfound knowledge kind of scared me. He told me it was perfectly normal that I was scared, and that most of his adult patients react in the same way. He then told me it was also normal that I disagreed with what he was saying, since dreaming implies a subconscious feeling that the brain refuses to accept. That did kind of make sense to me. He told me that in the next few days, I should be slightly more disobedient when it came to my parents. He told me to try saying no more often, and to argue with them when I didn't get my way. So that's what I did. For 3 days after talking to him, I behaved so uncharacteristically that my parents got concerned. They told me they didn't like my recent behavior, and I'd better quit it. It killed me to do that to them, but I couldn't stand having nightmares literally every night. My 10-year-old self would have done anything to put an end to those night terrors. They didn't stop though. In fact, they actually got worse. More graphic, more disturbing, and more vivid. It was too much. I confided in Uncle Joseph again, and he told me there was one more thing we could try. I begged him to tell me what it was, but he seemed hesitant. After a few minutes of pleading, he revealed what the thing was. He said my brain was too mature for my young body and that I needed to set it free. Obviously, I had no idea what he meant by that. He told me if I had one more nightmare, he'd tell me what I had to do. I went to sleep, terrified that night. I didn't want to set my body free, even if I didn't know what he was talking about. That night, I actually woke up before having a nightmare. In the several days that this had been going on, I had never woken up before having a nightmare. This was new. For some reason, though, I was scared to move or even breathe loudly. It wasn't sleep paralysis, but I was scared out of my mind. I stared at the wall in that same position for a full minute, not quite sure what I was doing. The next thing I heard was something I will never forget, no matter how hard I try. Whispering, right next to my ear. Uncle Joseph's whispering. I was sure of it. I turned over and screamed, which sent him flying back. He quickly left the room and shut the door. I sat there in a cold sweat. Part of me thought I was still having a nightmare. Instead of going back to sleep, I ran to my parents' room and told them everything. I told them about the nightmares, about Uncle Joseph, about everything. My dad didn't waste a second. He stormed into Uncle Joseph's room and confronted him. My uncle obviously denied everything, but my dad was a big dude and could easily push him around. A fight broke out between them, and my dad snatched the satchel Uncle Joe carried everywhere. Uncle Joseph promptly gathered up his things and basically ran to his car. My dad started going through the satchel, but what he found was sickening. There were pages and pages of dream-related things, both handwritten notes and printed articles. Articles about inducing dreams, specifically nightmares. Personal notes about different techniques, previous data, and types of experiments. It was horrific. Uncle Joseph was eventually arrested, as the police found some even more suggestive things on his computer. I'm not going to go into full detail, but I'm sure you could piece together what they found based on Uncle Joseph wanting to set my body free. I never saw him again. I don't know what happened to him long term, since my parents never liked talking about the situation, at least around me. Sometimes I kick myself for being so naive about the whole thing, but there's nothing I can do about that now.